Before I get into the story, it's very important for me to give a back history and some context surrounding my relationships with men growing up as a child. By doing so, hopefully everyone can understand my attachment style, my trust issues, and my abandonment issues I experience now as an adult. I know the number one question I'll get is why didn't I leave the relationship sooner when I started to notice red flags or any of the narcissistic behavior when it was happening. Now that I've had some time to be alone, sit with my thoughts, and reflect on the situation, it's something I ask myself all the time as well. This was my very first time dealing with a narcissist up close and personal. When I would hear the word, it always felt like people used it so loosely. But it wasn't until I started doing my own research on what a narcissist was and the behaviors that they present, I was able to identify all the times I was being manipulated, gaslit, and even breadcrumbed during the time of my relationship with Rasheed. Ultimately, it was my decision to stay in the relationship because I wanted to see it through and I thought I could change not only him, but the outcome, which is completely wrong to think that in life we can change people who don't see anything wrong with their behaviors or simply just don't want to change, period. I hope by giving you an insight to my past, it can help anyone watching this understand why I stayed in the relationship for so long. Now, let's get into it. Navigating my relationships with men as a child was both a huge struggle and a challenge for me. During that time, the men who were supposed to love me, protect me, and keep me safe did the complete opposite. For as long as I can remember, I've always known I was going to be different. Now, I didn't know what gay meant or anything like that, but I also think the people around me knew I was going to be different as well and took complete advantage of me. The foundation to all of this really does begin with my dad. My dad was in and out of my life up until I was about 14 or 15. And growing up, I just remember my dad being a superhero in my eyes. He was a very well known barber in Austin, Texas. And just to see the interactions between him and the people's hair that he was cutting, the vibes, the good conversation, all the good stuff that happens in a barbershop, I was just so proud to be his child. I didn't know at the time, but the type of love he provided to me was very toxic, and it definitely set the tone for all of my relationships moving forward. Now, we're going to jump forward and put my dad on the back burner. I just wanted to give everyone a little insight on how my dad was my first lover, but also my first heartbreak. Now, my mom has two kids. It's me and my brother. We're both 5 years apart. I'm the oldest. And prior to my brother being born, my mom was dating his dad. And that was probably the very first experience I had with men surrounding love. I was in kindergarten at the time, and being so young and vulnerable, it was a lot at the time that I really didn't understand. But, for whatever reason, almost every day, for as long as I can remember, he was just so cruel and evil to me. He would beat me for no reason. He would make me stand in a corner holding like heavy cans like this, and would just make me write multiple sentences all the time. It wasn't until my family started to notice marks on me and my behaviors changing that my mom removed us from the situation, but those scars lasted with me even until this day. I always wondered, how could you treat a child like that? I was so young. As I started to get older, my trauma grew worse. I had an uncle that would isolate me and treat me like I didn't even exist, and a few other male figures within my family who could care less to be even bothered with me. When I started to develop more is when I think people were really catching on that I was going to be gay. And I didn't really talk much about my earlier sexual experiences, but like most people, I wasn't able to choose when to lose my virginity. It was taken from me. For some years, I was molested by two of my male cousins. And as a curious child, I didn't know who to run to or who to tell, so I just dealt with it. I couldn't really talk to anyone or ask for help, and navigating being gay because my family was predominantly a Christian based household as far as religious beliefs were concerned. I had a neighborhood friend at the time that lived on my grandma's block who was about maybe 4 or 5 years older than me. And at the time, I had to have been maybe about 12. And one day he just held me down and made me have sex with him. And that continued for about a year or two. So by this point, I think my brain started to develop a mindset that people who touched me or engaged in sexual acts with me meant that they loved me. And going back to my dad, before he completely left my life, he would be in and out of my life and would show his love by giving me gifts here and there, which developed my love language of gifting. I believe in relationships, when I would give things, it was a way of showing my love to the person I was with at the time. And that's definitely not a healthy habit to develop, but that's where I am right now. And now at 14, 15, I was talking and crying to my mom about my dad being absent. I finally took action and told him how I felt, which in return, he decided to walk out of my life for good. And now at 30, I haven't even heard from him since. As a child, it didn't really bother me as much, but now as an adult, it's haunting me. And because he initiated all of the abandonment issues that I experience today, as I continued to grow older, I started to have my share of down low men where I was on a high by being able to experience being with the man in my eyes that everyone wanted, or at least wanted to be with. But when the experience would end and they didn't want to be with me anymore, it was a revolving door that left me damaged and hurt. So I think that explains a lot why now, as a trans woman, I'm continuing to go through these similar problems. But in my opinion, it's worse now because I'm completely in a different pool of dating when it comes to men that I wasn't able to get prior to me starting my transition. And we can see what so many women go through when it comes to dating or being in relationships. But mind you, all these things were explained to most of my relationships at some point when I felt safe and comfortable to share that information. And yet I still got treated the same in most situations. I don't want to spend too much time talking about my past, but I think this will give everyone a better insight as I explain my story dating Rasheed and why I tried so hard to make the relationship work and didn't want him to leave my life. So in 2020, 2021, I was dating someone briefly, and one night we decided to stay in and chill. At this time, he had only been to my house, so we finally decided, let's switch things up. He finally invited me over to his place where his other roommates were present, and respectfully, he introduced me to all of them. And this is where I met Rasheed. Now, as any human being, we all have eyes, and if we see someone attractive in a relationship or not, to ourselves, we're going to think it. And when I briefly introduced myself to him, I thought, well, nice dark skin complexion, nice teeth, full of tattoos. This was definitely my type at the time, but that was it. That was the introduction, and I continued my night as planned with the person I was dating at that time. When that relationship came to an end, I took some time to myself, and at some point, I did eventually get back on the dating apps. The main dating app that I used was BLK or Black, and within a week or so, me and Rasheed had matched with each other. I knew he looked familiar, I just couldn't remember where I knew him from, so we set just as matches for a while, didn't interact or anything. One day he ended up initiating the conversation and reached out to me. Now, as the conversation continued, we were both trying to figure out where we knew each other from. And it finally had hit me that he was the roommate from my previous relationship. This is how our relationship started, as friends with benefits. For a few years, we would just link up from time to time, have sex, a little conversation here and there, and that was it. So I didn't really know him outside of that. You know, how you have a roster, but within that roster, you have like your top pick or your top picks. For me, at the time, Rasheed was my top pick. I loved everything about him and the situation that we had going on. Now, as things started to progress, I would say maybe a year before I got into the situation that I'm in now, we had only been using condoms when we would have sex. But that changed within that year, and we started to have unprotected sex. Now, I'm not sure about everyone else, but for me, when you take that step, it starts a different connection between you and the person. I'm super cautious and safe when it comes to things like this. So I started to slowly eliminate the rest of my roster and fully depend on Rasheed when it came to anything involving myself sexually. Everything stayed the same like normal up until maybe last year in 2023, where me and him were starting to see each other more often and we're having deeper conversations and really just connecting on a different level. By this point, my feelings were starting to develop more for him, and I wanted to take it to the next level, but I didn't know how he would feel about that. So I just left things as they were. He had mentioned to me before he also had feelings for me, but we never explored the option of being with each other. Now, I want everyone to pay attention to certain things I'm going to mention because it will make sense the deeper I get into the story. It was a few red flags I started to notice within him, but again, I was so wrapped up in the situation, I didn't pay it any mind. I had surgery out of the country last year around April, and before then, you know, Rasheed would be on and off seeing me, and the communication started to die down until I didn't hear from him for about 2 months. During those 2 months, I was telling my friends how I think he ghosted me, and I just couldn't understand really what happened between us for him to do that to me. So I just started to like fall back, and as I started to move on and just, went back to talking to other people and casually getting back on the dating apps, you know, I did delete and block him after not having any communication with him anymore at the time. But fast forward, we're now in July of 2023. I'm healing well from my surgery. I'm acting bad. I'm, getting back to my normal life. My brother wanted to come down from Texas and spend his birthday here. So my brother came down to visit me. And towards the end of the trip, guess who I connected with again? Rasheed. He told me he wasn't ignoring me, but rather he had been busy and that he had wanted to see me. And this is all in one day. But remember that part. So that same day we connected, he came to see me. Now, if anyone knows my brother, he's the complete opposite of me, your typical hood type dude, rapper, whatever. But he told me something that I will never forget and should have really took note, the night me and Rasheed reconnected. When he came over, he walked just straight into my room and didn't speak to my brother at all. Now, for me, I didn't think anything of it because I just feel like some men are just that way, especially when they're around somebody else that they don't know. And my brother's a giant. My brother's like 6'5", so I didn't pay it any mind. I got it. My brother told me he knew right away Rasheed wasn't a genuine person because how could you come into someone's house, that's your friend or your lover and not speak to their family? And I respect him so much now for saying that because he was right. So the night continued and he started to open up to me about his living situation in his apartment. He was having problems with the landlord. The landlord was trying to take, I guess, him and the other roommates to court because the person that I dated at the time ran off on the rent and left them stuck with that portion of the rent. He just felt stressed, and I could tell because he never spent the night with me before, but on this particular night he asked me to, and of course I let him because I missed him and I wanted to be there for him and everything, that he needed help with. As we're talking, I asked him, so what are your plans, for moving? He told me he had plans to sublease an apartment from his barber, but it would take about 2 months because the barber was moving down south, I think to maybe like Florida or something. I can't remember. Now, as a friend, and obviously you being my lover at the time, we both just suggested he just move in with me until everything was squared away. We continued the summer like normal, doing everything we had done before because his lease wasn't up until August. Now August comes around and it's about to be my 30th birthday, and I planned a big trip to three different countries. I went to London, I went to Paris, and I also went to Portugal. So as I'm starting to get everything ready for him, I got him a set of keys. I started cleaning out space in my apartment for him to, prepare his stuff and have, just space for him to get his stuff together. Um, my birthday is a huge thing for me, and I mean a huge thing for me. And if you know me, you know I'm talking about my birthday months in advance. And this is where another red flag came into place. Me and Rasheed hung out 2 days before my birthday, talking about my plans and what I would be doing. The day of my birthday, I didn't hear anything from him all day. No happy birthday texts, no nothing. And it really hurt my feelings to the point at my dinner, I'm telling everyone about it, but I didn't have time to really process it because the next day was my birthday vacation and I had a flight to catch early that morning. This was another red flag that I ignored. So, being involved with someone, and you always want to make sure that you can support them and show up for them in any way possible. And that's the kind of person that I was. And his birthday was shortly after mine's. And before I went out the country, I had picked him up some gifts to celebrate with him when I would return from my trip. You know, my problem is I always think people will treat me how I treat them, but that's never the case. And so when I finally mentioned to him about how I felt when I came to my birthday, the only thing he told me was, I'm sorry, I totally forgot. But I knew in my mind he didn't forget because we had just spent time together. But again, I didn't want to think too much into it, especially with him moving in right around the corner. I mean, no flowers, no nothing to really show that he was really sorry for what happened. So, after having such a changing, or I should say, life changing experience solo traveling out of the country, I really was so excited for what was to come next as I turned 30, trying to reach all of my goals and really start getting to business on what I wanted to accomplish in my life. Rasheed finally moved in at the end of August, and for the first few weeks, everything was fine. We had discussed what our do's and don'ts were and just what everything would look like for the short time that he would be living with me. Now, when he moved in, I definitely tried to set a boundary and I asked him, do you want to sleep in the living room? Just for privacy reasons. I have an air mattress and I really don't mind you using it. Because I knew we would be having sex either way while he was here. He specifically said he wanted to sleep with me. So that's what we ended up doing. Now, as a few more weeks went by, we started to get more comfortable with each other and started to do things together around the house, like, watching movies, TV shows, playing games, just regular stuff. In reality, doing all the couple things without a title. The fall winter season has started to really kick in, and Rasheed is a deep sleeper. I mean, to the point where you would literally have to scream or shout or physically move him for him to wake up. It was on one particular night where we were sleeping, and I used to leave my window cracked, open just to get some fresh air, the cool breeze, the feeling. It feels good at night, but it was a little too cold on this particular night, and it woke me up out of my sleep. So as I was getting up to close it, I noticed his phone on, bright light. Now, any of my relationships I've had in the past, I've never been the type to go through phones, but it was opened, and I'm not going to lie, I kind of felt like everything happened that night for a reason. So, me being curious, I started to go through it, and they always say if you go looking for something, you're going to find it. And well, indeed, that's exactly what happened. He had every dating app you could think about. I mean, Tinder, BOK, Bumble, Hinge. even down to his other social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook. I spent hours going through the phone, and not even exaggerating, I found him talking to over 100 different women that were different ages, nationalities, body types. He definitely has a type. I think he loves women to be more on the thicker side, if anything. And the type of messages were all the same. He was telling women he wanted to get them pregnant, start a family with them, and just corny stuff like, let me be the reason I get you off this app. And just a bunch of other things. Now, some of the women had common sense and thought the same thing that I did, that it wasn't normal and it was very weird for someone to say all these things to them, barely knowing them. I was just so disgusted, like my stomach was in knots, and I felt my heart almost drop to my feet because, at bare minimum, you're living with me, and at this point, we're having unprotected sex. So I would at least think you would have respect for me, but you didn't. For the remainder of the night, I spent the rest of the night in the living room just thinking about what I had just discovered about him. When the next morning came and he was getting ready for work, I told him I wasn't sure what his plans were with the apartment he had going on. I don't know what the communication was between him and the barber, but I needed him to move out by the end of the month. And this is where my life would slowly start to take a turn for the worse. Stay tuned for part 2.